Hello, everyone. I'm your sleep sinners for tonight, here to guide you into a peaceful and mysterious slumber. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time is it for you right now. Go ahead, get comfortable, relax, and let the rain and stories take you away. Curse of the Tsingy, Madagascar. Chapter 1. The Vanishing. The first thing Kodo Rakutamalala noticed wasn't the razor-sharp limestone spires stretching toward the sky like a forest of crystal daggers. It wasn't the oppressive heat that made his Columbia Field shirt cling to his back like a second skin. It wasn't even the eerie silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. It was the footprints. Wet footprints leading into the maze of stone needles, and none coming back out. "Hey, Dr. Laurent." Kodo called, his voice carrying across the camp where the botanical research team had set up their equipment. "You need to see this." Dr. Amy Laurent, the expedition leader, jogged over, her dreadlocks bouncing against her shoulders. At 35, she was one of the youngest apartment heads at the University of Antananarivo, and this mapping expedition to the Tsingy de Bemaraha was supposed to be her career-defining project. "What's up?" she asked, crouching beside Kodo. "These weren't here an hour ago," he said, pointing to the glistening tracks that had disappeared between two towering limestone blades. "And look, they're still wet, but there's been no rain." Dr. Laurent's expression darkened. "That's the third set this week. You think it's connected to those missing hikers from last month?" Kodo asked, lowering his voice so they were alone on the perimeter. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to finish our work here and get out before the real storm hits." She glanced at the sky, which remained stubbornly, impossibly clear despite the forecast of torrential rain. "You mean the weather, right?" Kodo asked, though they both knew she didn't. Before she could answer, a sound cut through the still air, a distant drumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rhythmic, primal, almost beckoning. "There it is again," Kodo whispered. "The drums." "There are no villages for miles," Dr. Laurent reminded him, "and no one could carry drums through the Tsingy. It's impossible." As they spoke, the sun began its rapid descent toward the horizon. Twilight in Madagascar came quickly, especially in the shadow of the stone forest. Something about the darkness made the limestone formations look alive, like petrified giants waiting to move once human eyes weren't watching. "We should get back," Dr. Laurent said. But as they turned to head toward camp, Kodo froze. Among the footprints they'd been examining was now a single perfect handprint, as if someone had crawled out of the stone labyrinth and pressed their palm into the mud. It was still dripping. "No way I'm going out after dark," said Niraina, the team's photographer, as she scrolled through the day's images on her laptop. Her fingers paused on a photo of the western edge of the Tsingy. "Wait, what is that?" The research team gathered around her screen in their main tent. In the corner of the image, partially obscured by shadow, was what appeared to be a figure standing among the stone pinnacles. Not on a path. No human could stand there, but seemingly among the razor-sharp spires themselves. "Probably just a shadow," said Dr. Laurent, though she didn't sound convinced. "I don't like this place," Tahina, their local guide, muttered. Though only 26, the youngest of their group, Tahina carried himself with the gravity of someone who had seen too much. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the Tsingy. She said they weren't just rocks. They were people once." "What happened to them?" asked Kodo. "They made the spirits angry. The spirits turned their bones to stone as punishment," Tahina said, his eyes never leaving the tent entrance. "They say at night, the stone people try to lure others to join them." "That's just a folk tale," Dr. Laurent said firmly. "All folk tales have seeds of truth," Tahina countered. "Like the drums." Everyone hears them, but no one finds their source. As if summoned by his words, the drumming started again, louder now that darkness had fallen completely. It carried a rhythm that felt almost familiar, like a heartbeat, but more complex, more intentional. Niraina slammed her laptop shut. I can't focus with that noise. We need to secure the perimeter, Dr. Loron decided. Set up more lights. Whatever's going on here, I'm not losing another expedition to the Tsingy ghost stories. Another? Kodo asked sharply. Dr. Loron hesitated, then sighed. There was a team here 3 years ago. Geological survey. 3 researchers disappeared. The official report said they got lost in the formations and died of dehydration. But you don't believe that, Kodo guessed. Their bodies were never found, she said quietly. Just like those hikers last month. Just like a dozen others over the past decade who went missing without a trace, always after hearing the drums. Outside, the rhythmic pounding grew louder, more insistent, and mixed within it now, unmistakably, was what sounded like voices. Do you hear that? Whispered Niraina, her face pale. They're calling names. They fell silent, listening, and there it was within the drum beats, something that sounded eerily like Kodo. Kodo felt his blood turn to ice. That's impossible. Dr. Loron grabbed her field pack. Nobody leaves this tent tonight. Nobody. She pulled out her satellite phone, but the screen remained dark. No signal. Of course. The equipment. Tahina said suddenly. We left the spectrometer at mapping site B. It can wait until morning, Dr. Loron replied. That's $100,000 piece of equipment, Kodo pointed out. And Site B is just at the edge of the formation. I can see it from here. He pointed to the soft glow of the device's standby light, barely visible about 50 meters from their camp. I'll go, he decided, grabbing his flashlight. 2 minutes, tops. Kodo, wait, Dr. Loron began, but he was already unzipping the tent. The air outside felt different, heavier, charged with something beyond humidity. The drums were louder here, no longer distant, but seeming to vibrate from the stone formations themselves. The beat was hypnotic, almost soothing. Kodo forced himself to focus on the spectrometer's light and began walking. Strange how the distance seemed greater now than it had appeared from the tent. The beam of his flashlight caught the edges of the nearest limestone spires, turning them ghostly white against the pitch-black night. That's when he noticed the footprints again, wet, glistening in his flashlight beam, leading from the direction of their camp toward the heart of the Tsingy. But these were fresh, and they were his own. Kodo looked down in horror. Each step he took left a shimmering footprint, though the ground was bone dry. It was as if he were walking through invisible water that only adhered to his feet. The drumming intensified, and now he could clearly hear his name woven through the rhythm. Not just his name, his full name that he hadn't told anyone on the expedition. Kotanazanako Raktamalala. The voices whispered with the drums. Come home. Kodo turned to run back to camp, but found himself facing not the warm glow of their tent lights, but an endless maze of stone needles. Somehow, without realizing it, he had walked directly into the Tsingy, which was impossible. He'd been walking in a straight line toward the spectrometer. The voices grew louder, more insistent. And now, moving between the stone spires, he saw them, shadowy figures that seemed partially formed of the limestone itself. Their eyes glowed with a soft, bluish light. Your ancestors have waited for you, they whispered in perfect unison with the drum beats. The stones remember your blood. Kodo backed away, only to feel the sharp edge of limestone against his back. He was surrounded. Loron, he screamed. Tahina, help. But his voice seemed swallowed by the stone, transformed into nothing more than another beat in the endless drumming that now filled his head completely. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his own hand pressed against one of the stone spires, and the limestone rippling like water around his fingers, pulling him in. Chapter 2, The Search. Dr. Amy Loron jolted awake at dawn, her neck stiff from falling asleep against the tent pole. She'd meant to stay awake all night, waiting for Kodo's return. "Kodo?" she called, looking around the tent. Niraina and Tahina were still asleep on their cots, but Kodo's remained untouched. "Guys, wake up!" she shouted, shaking them both. Kodo never came back. Tahina was on his feet instantly, already reaching for his boots. "I told you," he said grimly. "The Tsingy took him." "The Tsingy didn't take anyone," Dr. Loron snapped, though her voice lacked conviction. "He probably got disoriented in the dark and made camp somewhere until sunrise." They emerged from the tent to find the morning sun casting long shadows across the limestone landscape. The formations looked almost beautiful in the golden light, until you remembered how easily their razor edges could slice through flesh. "The spectrometer's still there," Niraina pointed out, gesturing to where the device sat exactly where they'd left it the day before. He never reached it. Dr. Loron tried her satellite phone again. Still no signal. "We need to organize a search. Tahina, you take the north perimeter. Niraina, east. I'll cover the south and west. Stay within shouting distance of camp, and no one, absolutely no one, goes into the formations alone. What if we find—" Niraina couldn't finish the sentence. "We'll find him," Dr. Loron said firmly. "People don't just vanish." But as the words left her mouth, she couldn't help remembering the wet footprints leading into nowhere, the voices and the drums, the shadow in Irina's photograph. They separated, each carrying radios that probably wouldn't work this close to the massive limestone structures, which seemed to interfere with all electronic signals. Dr. Loron found herself constantly checking the ground for footprints as she walked the perimeter of their designated research area. An hour into her search, she spotted something that made her heart sink. Kodo's flashlight, lying on the ground at the very edge of the stone labyrinth. When she picked it up, it was still warm, as if it had been used recently. "Kodo," she called, her voice echoing against the stone. "Kodo." Only silence answered her, but as she turned to head back to camp to show the others her find, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement deep within the maze of stone pillars. "Hello," she called, taking an involuntary step closer to the Tsingy's edge. "Is someone there?" The figure moved again, just a shadow really, but unmistakably human-shaped. It stood impossibly balanced atop one of the knife-edge ridges that no person could possibly navigate, and it was beckoning to her. Dr. Loron backed away slowly. "Tahina," she called into her radio. "Niraina, I think I found something." Static answered her. Of course. She looked back at the figure in the Tsingy. It was closer now, though she hadn't seen it move. Its form seemed to shift between solid and transparent, as if it couldn't quite decide whether to be human or stone. Dr. Loron. She whirled around to find Tahina standing behind her, his face grim. "Thank God," she breathed. "Did you see that? There's someone in there." "Where?" Tahina asked, squinting into the maze of stone. She turned back to point, but the figure was gone. It was right there, I swear, standing on the formations. Tahina's expression darkened further. "We need to leave this place. Now!" "We can't leave without Kodo." "Kodo is gone," Tahina said bluntly, "just like the others. The Tsingy has taken him." "That's ridiculous," Dr. Loron snapped. "People don't get taken by rocks." "Not by the rocks," Tahina corrected. "By what lives in them. The Vahini, the strangers who were here before people. My grandmother said they were trapped in the stone by ancient magic, and now they need fresh blood to escape. That's just a story." Dr. Loron insisted. Then how do you explain this? Tahina held out his hand. In his palm lay a small object that Dr. Loron recognized instantly. Kodo's ID badge. The plastic was partially melted, as if it had been pressed against something superheated. Where did you find this? She demanded. Inside the thingy, Tahina admitted. I followed some tracks. You went in there alone? After I specifically said, I know these formations, he cut her off. I grew up near here. But what I found, he shook his head. The tracks led to a spot where the limestone looked different, softer, like it had been liquid and hardened again. Dr. Loron took the melted ID badge, turning it over in her hands. The photo was still visible. Kodo's smiling face looking back at her. This doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense if you believe the stories, Tahina said quietly. The drums will start again at sunset, and they'll call another name. Before Dr. Loron could respond, Nirina's voice crackled over the radio, faint but audible. Guys, I found something weird. Eastern perimeter. You need to see this. They found Nirina staring at the ground near where the forest met the beginning of the Tsingy Plateau. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a perfect handprint, identical to the one Kodo had discovered yesterday, but larger. That wasn't there when we walked this area yesterday, Nirina said, her voice shaking slightly. And look, it's still wet. Dr. Loron crouched to examine the print. The moisture glistened in the midday sun, though the ground around it was completely dry. When she hesitantly touched it, her finger came away with a clear, viscous fluid that didn't feel like water. It felt warmer, almost like blood. Tahina whispered, fresh blood. Dr. Loron jerked her hand back, wiping her finger frantically on her pants. That's impossible. Test it, Tahina challenged. You have equipment. 20 minutes later, they gathered around the portable analyzer in stunned silence. The readout was unmistakable. Human hemoglobin and plasma. This is Kodo's blood, Nirina whispered. Isn't it? Dr. Loron didn't answer. She was staring out at the Tsingy, where the afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch across the jagged landscape. For the first time in her career, science was failing to provide an explanation that made sense. We need to pack up, she decided suddenly. Right now, we're leaving before sunset. The nearest village is a 6-hour hike, Tahina pointed out. We can't make it before dark. We can make it to the ranger station in 3 hours if we hurry, Dr. Loron countered. We'll radio for help from there. They packed in frantic silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The spectrometer and most of their other expensive equipment would have to stay. There was no time to break it all down properly. Dr. Loron made a mental note to explain the emergency abandonment to the university board, though she had no idea what she would actually tell them. Sorry, but ancient blood spirits in the rocks took one of our researchers. Didn't seem like it would go over well in her report. As they stuffed the last of their personal gear into backpacks, Dr. Loron noticed Tahina placing small bundles of herbs at the corners of their camp. What are you doing? She asked. Protection, he said simply. We still have 2 hours until we reach the ranger station. The sun will set before then. You really believe all this, don't you? She asked quietly. Tahina looked up, his eyes dead serious. My uncle was one of the geological survey team that disappeared 3 years ago. Dr. Loron felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me, he challenged, or would you have dismissed it as superstition, like you're doing now? Before she could answer, the ground beneath them trembled slightly. The vibration so subtle they might have missed it if they hadn't all gone completely still. Earthquake, Nirina suggested hopefully, but they all knew better. The vibration had a rhythm to it. The drums were starting early. Run. Tahina said, slinging his pack over his shoulder. Don't stop for anything. They set off at a brisk pace, following the narrow trail that led away from the Tsingy and toward the ranger station. The drumming grew steadily louder behind them, no longer distant or ethereal, but solid and real, like hundreds of hands pounding on stone. And woven between the beats, just as before, were voices. This time, they weren't calling Kodo's name. Amy Loran. The voices whispered in perfect unison with the drums. Your blood remembers. Come home. Dr. Loran stumbled, nearly twisting her ankle on a root. Did you hear that? She gasped. Hear what? Niraina asked, pausing to help her up. The voices, they're saying my name. Niraina and Tahina exchanged worried glances. I just hear the drums, Niraina admitted. They only called to the one they've chosen, Tahina said grimly. We need to move faster. The sun was sinking rapidly now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. The shadows from the trees stretched long across their path, seeming to reach for them like grasping fingers. Almost at the halfway point, Tahina encouraged as they hurried along the increasingly dark trail. There's a clearing up ahead where we can rest for a minute. But as they emerged into the small clearing, they stopped short. Standing in the center, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight, was Kodo. Only it wasn't quite Kodo. His skin had a strange grayish cast to it, almost as if it were made of stone, whispered Niraina in horror. Kodo's body seemed to flicker between solid flesh and something else, something mineral and ancient. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice harmonized perfectly with the distant drums. Why are you running? He asked, his tone curious rather than threatening. Don't you hear them calling? They've been waiting so long. Kodo, Dr. Loran said carefully, taking a step toward him. What happened to you? Who's they? His smile was serene, almost beatific. The first people, the ones who became the Tsingy. They're lonely, Amy. They need company. That's not Kodo, Tahina hissed, grabbing Dr. Loran's arm to stop her from moving closer. It's using his shape, his voice, but it's not him. The thing that looked like Kodo tilted its head. Of course it's me. I'm just more now, and soon you'll be too, Amy. They chose you next. As he spoke, the ground around him began to ripple like water, though it remained solid. The grass and earth took on the texture and color of limestone. Run, Tahina shouted, pulling both women back toward the trail. They fled, no longer concerned with the gear on their backs or the growing darkness behind them. The drumming reached a fever pitch, and now other voices joined in, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, all calling Dr. Loran's name in perfect rhythm. Don't look back, Tahina warned as they sprinted down the darkening path. Whatever happens, don't look back. But Dr. Loran couldn't help herself. As they rounded a bend in the trail, she glanced over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The forest behind them was transforming. Trees twisted into impossible shapes that resembled limestone spires. The ground itself seemed to be rising up in sharp, needle-like formations. The Tsingy was spreading, following them, and moving among the newly formed stone forests were figures. Some recognizably human, others only vaguely so. All had the same bluish glow emanating from their eyes. One of them was unmistakably Kodo. They're coming, Dr. Loran gasped. The stone is coming. The ranger station appeared ahead, a small wooden building with a metal roof, illuminated by a single floodlight. It had never looked so beautiful. Help! Niraina screamed as they approached. Emergency! The door of the station flew open, and a uniformed ranger appeared, flashlight in hand. What's going on? He demanded. Lock the doors, Tahina ordered as they rushed inside. Block the windows. Now! To his credit, The ranger, whose name tag identified him as Mamie, didn't ask questions. Perhaps something in their faces told him everything he needed to know. The radio, Dr. Loron gasped, trying to catch her breath. We need to call for evacuation. Mamie's expression fell. Radio's been out since this morning. Some kind of interference. Outside, the drumming had stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. What's happening? Mamie asked, peering through the window. Don't look outside, Tahina warned. And whatever you hear, don't open the door until morning. As if in answer to his words, there came a soft knock at the door, then another, and another. Soon, it sounded like dozens of hands were gently tapping all around the station. On the doors, the windows, the walls, the roof. Amy called a voice that sounded exactly like Kodo's. Open the door. We're waiting for you. Dr. Loron pressed her hands over her ears, but the voice seemed to bypass them entirely, speaking directly into her mind. Your ancestors are here, the voice continued. Your great-grandmother Asina, your Uncle Rivo, they all found their way home to the stone. It's your turn now. How does it know my family? Dr. Loron whispered, her face pale. It reads minds, Tahina said grimly. It finds the connections that will make you listen, make you doubt. Outside, the tapping continued, growing more insistent. The wooden walls of the station began to vibrate with the rhythm. We need to hold out until dawn, Tahina said, looking around the small station for anything they could use as additional barriers. Once the sun rises, they'll retreat. And then what? Naraina demanded. We can't stay here forever. We get as far from the Tsingy as possible, Tahina replied, and we never come back. What about Kodo? Dr. Loron asked quietly. Tahina's expression softened slightly. Kodo is gone. Whatever's out there, it's not him anymore. The tapping suddenly stopped. For a moment, they dared to hope that perhaps the entities had given up. Then the walls began to change. The wooden planks rippled like fabric in a breeze, their color lightening to a pale gray. Before their horrified eyes, the wood was transforming into limestone. They're coming through the walls. Naraina screamed. Mamie grabbed his emergency flare gun from the shelf. Will fire work against them? Worth a try, Tahina said, reaching for it. But before he could take it, the flare gun crumbled in Mamie's hand, turning to limestone dust. The transformation was spreading rapidly now. The floor beneath their feet, the ceiling above them, everything was becoming stone. And within the stone, faces began to appear, ghostly impressions of human features caught in a moment of transition. One of them was unmistakably Kodo, his eyes closed as if sleeping, his expression peaceful. The roof, Dr. Loron shouted, pointing to where the metal sheets remained untransformed. Metal. They can't change metal. The ranger vehicles, Mamie realized, in the garage out back. They're metal. They made a desperate dash for the back door, which was already half stone and crumbling. Beyond it was a small garage containing 2 dusty jeeps. Keys, Tahina asked urgently. Mamie pulled a ring from his pocket. These work for both. They piled into the nearest jeep. Mamie gunned the engine before they'd even closed the doors. The garage door was already transforming, limestone crystals growing across its surface like accelerated frost. Hold on, Mamie warned as he floored the accelerator. The jeep crashed through the partially solidified door, showering them with stone fragments as they burst into the night. Behind them, the ranger station had become a bizarre hybrid, half wooden structure, half Tsingy formation, and surrounding it were dozens of figures, all with that same bluish glow emanating from their eyes. Don't look at them, Tahina shouted as Mamie swerved on the main road. Just drive. They sped through the darkness, the headlights illuminating the narrow dirt road that led away from park. No one spoke, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fear. After about 15 minutes, when they were several kilometers from the ranger station, Niraina finally broke the silence. Do you think they'll follow us? Tahina looked out the back window, at the dark road behind them. I don't know. The stories say they can't leave the Tsingy, but the stories also said the Tsingy couldn't spread. What are you all talking about? Mamie demanded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. What were those things? Dr. Loron opened her mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could she explain something she didn't understand herself? Something that defied every scientific principle she'd built her career on? The Tsingy is alive, she said finally. Somehow. And it takes people. Transforms them, Tahina corrected. Makes them part of itself. Mamie's expression suggested he thought they were all insane, but he'd seen enough not to dismiss them outright. So what do we do now? We get to Morindava. Tahina decided. Contact the authorities. Tell them to quarantine the entire Tsingy region. And say what? Niraina asked bitterly. Sorry, but the rocks are eating people. They'll lock us up. We need proof, Dr. Loron realized. The blood sample. The photos. Kodo's melted ID badge. It's not much, but it's something. They're still in our packs, Tahina pointed out. Back at the station. A heavy silence fell over the jeep as they all contemplated returning to the horror they'd just escaped. Wait, Niraina said suddenly, patting her jacket pocket. My backup memory card. I always keep yesterday's photos on a separate card. She pulled out a small SD card, holding it up like a sacred relic. It has the shadow figure in the Tsingy. It wasn't much, but it was something, a starting point. As they drove through the night toward civilization, Dr. Loron couldn't shake the sound of the drums from her mind, couldn't forget the sight of Kodo's face captured in stone, peaceful yet somehow aware. And underneath it all was a terrible question she couldn't bring herself to ask aloud. What if part of her had wanted to stay? Because for just a moment, when she'd heard the voices calling her name, it had felt like coming home. Chapter 3, The Return. 3 months later, Dr. Amy Loron stood at the edge of the newly established military perimeter surrounding the Tsingy de Bemarath National Park. Red and white warning signs in multiple languages declared the area closed due to geological instability. Armed guards patrolled the fence line 24/7. It had taken weeks of arguing with government officials, presenting their evidence, and being dismissed as trauma victims suffering from shared delusions. But when the next research team sent to investigate their abandoned camp also disappeared without a trace, the authorities had finally taken notice, especially when the limestone formations were discovered to have expanded by nearly a kilometer in all directions since their mapping expedition. Dr. Loron? She turned to find General Razafai approaching, his uniform immaculate despite the sweltering heat. As a military commander in charge of the quarantine operation, he had initially been the most skeptical of her claims. Now he looked haunted, the dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept well in weeks. You shouldn't be here, he said, though there was no real admonishment in his tone. This area is restricted. I know, she replied. I just needed to see it again. He nodded, understanding. The perimeter is holding. For now. What he didn't say, what none of the official reports mentioned, was that the expansion of the Tsingy had merely slowed, not stopped. Every week, the stone forest crept outward another few meters. At this rate, it would reach the nearest village within a year. Any sign of the missing teams? She asked quietly. The general's jaw tightened. Sometimes at night, the patrol reports seeing figures moving within the formations. Impossible positions, they say. And the drums. He trailed off, They've heard them, too. Every night at sunset, he confirmed. And they say there are voices in them now. More voices than before. Dr. Loron closed her eyes briefly, knowing that among those voices would be Kodos, and possibly the entire Geological Survey team from 3 years ago, and the hikers from last year, and now the recovery team. How many? How many lives had the Tsingy claimed over the centuries? General, she said carefully, have your men noticed any unusual effects? Thoughts that don't seem like their own? A pull toward the formations. The sharp look he gave her confirmed her fears before he even spoke. 3 guards have been relieved of duty in the past week. All reported hearing their names in the drums. One was caught trying to cut through the fence last night. It's getting stronger, she whispered. My superiors are considering more permanent containment options. The general said, his voice low. You mean bombing it? Dr. Loron couldn't keep the horror from her voice. It won't work. The stone absorbs. It doesn't destroy. Then what do you suggest, Doctor? We can't let it spread to populated areas. Before she could answer, a young soldier approached, saluting nervously. Sir, there's a call for Dr. Loron. From someone named Tahina. He says it's urgent. Dr. Loron felt a chill despite the heat. She hadn't spoken to Tahina since they'd given their official statements. Last she'd heard, he'd returned to his village near Bekapaka, refusing all further involvement in the investigation. The general led her to their command tent, where a satellite phone awaited. She picked it up with trepidation. Tahina, you need to come to Bekapaka. His voice crackled through static. Now, I found something in my grandmother's house. Something about the Tsingy. What is it? She asked, heart racing. Not over the phone, he insisted. But I think we might be able to stop it. The village of Bekapaka lay just outside the southern edge of what had once been the national park boundary. Now it was dangerously close to the expanding Tsingy, close enough that evacuation plans were already being drawn up. Tahina met Dr. Loron at the small airstrip where her military transport had landed. He looked thinner than she remembered, his eyes haunted. Thank you for coming, he said simply. You said you found something? He nodded, leading her through the village to a small home near its edge. Inside, the single room was dominated by a large wooden table covered in ancient-looking papers, books, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. After my grandmother died last year, I inherited her house, Tahina explained. I never went through her things properly until now. He gestured to papers. She was a village historian, keeper of stories, and she had information about the Tsingy. Not just information, Tahina said, picking up what looked like a journal bound in cracked leather. A solution. He opened the journal carefully to a marked page and handed it to her. The text was written in elegant, faded script, some in Malagasy, some in what appeared to be a much older language. I can't read this, Dr. Loron admitted. It's a ritual, Tahina explained. A binding ritual that was performed hundreds of years ago to contain whatever lives in the Tsingy. My grandmother's notes say it was performed by a group of 7 village elders every 50 years to renew the binding. Dr. Loron looked up sharply. When was the last renewal supposed to be? 3 years ago, Tahina said grimly, around the time the Geological Survey team disappeared. The team your uncle was on, Dr. Loron realized. The one that never came back. Tahina nodded. When no one performed the ritual, the binding weakened. The Tsingy has been awakening ever since, hungry for new vessels. Dr. Loron tried to process this information. Part of her, the rational scientist, wanted to dismiss it all as folklore. But after what she'd witnessed in the stone forest, she couldn't afford that luxury anymore. This ritual, she said carefully, what does it involve? Tahina turned several pages in the journal, revealing detailed illustrations of 7 people standing at specific points around what was clearly meant to be the Tsingy Formation. Each held what looked like a small carved object. 7 people, 7 positions, 7 talismans, he explained. The talismans were made from the same limestone as the Tsingy itself, but treated with a mixture of native plants and other substances. What other substances? Dr. Loron asked, suspicion growing. Tahina hesitated. Blood. From each participant. Of course, she muttered. There's always blood. Not just any blood, Tahina continued. The ritual requires blood from people with specific connections to the land. The village chief, a healer, a hunter, a mother who has lost a child who has survived serious illness, someone who has traveled beyond the Great Water and returned, and someone who has heard the drums but resisted their call. He finished quietly. Dr. Loron felt a chill run down her spine. Like us. Tahina nodded. Like us. She studied the illustrations more carefully. The positions formed a 7-pointed star around the Tsingy, with each point seemingly aligned to specific features of the landscape. Even if we believe this could work, she said slowly, even if we could find 7 people who match these requirements, the military has the entire area locked down. They'd never allow a group of civilians to approach the Tsingy, let alone perform some ancient ritual. They will if the alternative is watching the Tsingy spread across the entire region, Tahina countered. Your scientists have no solution. Your military's weapons can't stop stone. This is the only option we have. Dr. Loron closed the journal, mind racing. I need to make some calls. Convincing General Razafai took 3 days of arguments, presentations, and finally a desperate plea. What tipped the scales was the military's own data. Satellite imagery showing the Tsingy's accelerating expansion and recordings of the nightly drumming that now carried for kilometers in every direction. When the voices and the drums began calling the names of soldiers who had never even approached the perimeter fence, the general finally relented. You have one chance, he told Dr. Loron as they finalized the plans in the command tent. One attempt at this ritual. If it fails, we move to Plan B, which is evacuation of all settlements within 50 kilometers, followed by targeted strikes with our most powerful ordnance, he said grimly. As you pointed out, it may not destroy the Tsingy, but it might slow it down enough for us to establish a more permanent containment strategy. Like nuclear options, Dr. Loron thought, but didn't say. The environmental disaster would be catastrophic, but perhaps preferable to whatever the Tsingy might become if left unchecked. We won't fail, she promised, with more confidence than she felt. Assembling their team of 7 had been surprisingly straightforward. Tahina qualified as someone who had heard the drums but resisted. Dr. Loron, with her semester at Oxford, fulfilled the requirement of having traveled beyond the Great Water and returned. The village chief of Bekapaka agreed to participate, as did the local healer. The remaining 3 positions were filled by a hunter from a neighboring village, a woman who had lost 2 children to malaria the previous year. Ironically, the youngest member of the Geological Survey team, who had survived a childhood bout with dengue fever that had killed his twin brother. Now, they stood at the command center, being briefed on the military escort that would take them to their positions around the Tsingy. Each team will consist of 1 ritual participant and 2 armed guards, General Razafai explained, pointing to the map where 7X marks indicated their positions. You will be in radio contact at all times. At the first sign of danger, any danger, you will be extracted immediately. The ritual needs to be completed in full, Tahina insisted. Once we begin, we can't stop. The general's expression hardened. The safety of my people comes first, Mr. Tahina. If those things come from my soldiers, we're pulling out. Is that clear? Tahina looked like he wanted to argue, but simply nodded. Dr. Loron studied the map again. Her position would be the farthest north, nearly a kilometer from the others. The isolation made her nervous, but according to Tahina's grandmother's journal, the positions were non-negotiable. They corresponded to something called the ancient binding points that had been established centuries ago. Remember, Tahina told the group as they prepared to deploy, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear, especially if they call your name, focus on the ritual. The words must be spoken precisely as written. He handed each of them a small piece of paper with phonetic pronunciations of the ancient Malagasy incantation. They had spent hours practicing the unfamiliar syllables until each could recite them flawlessly. And the talismans? Asked the village healer, a woman named Soa who appeared to be in her 70s. Tahina opened a wooden box, revealing 7 small carved limestone figurines. Each was rough-hewn into a vaguely human shape, with a small depression in the chest. When the time comes, he explained, we place a drop of our blood in the hollow, then plant the figurine in the ground while speaking the words. Dr. Loron picked up her assigned talisman. It felt strangely warm to the touch, almost alive. She quickly put it back in the box. Tried to ignore the way it seemed to pulse against her fingers. We move at dawn, General Razafai announced. Get some rest. Tomorrow will test us all. But rest proved elusive for Dr. Loron. In her tent on the military base, she found herself studying Tahina's grandmother's journal again and again, looking for anything they might have missed, any detail that could prove crucial. Around midnight, she came across a passage that made her blood run cold. One Tahina hadn't translated for the group. The Vahini hunger most for those who resist them. It read in faded Malagasy that she could just barely translate with her limited knowledge of the language. For the stronger the will that breaks, the stronger the stone becomes. She suddenly understood with terrible clarity why those who heard their names in the drums were the most sought-after targets. Why Kodo had been taken first, and why she had been chosen next. It wasn't random. It was strategic. And tomorrow, they would be deliberately placing the 7 people most likely to strengthen the Tsingian position surrounding it. Unless, of course, that was exactly what the ritual counted on, using the Tsingi's own hunger against it. She must have finally drifted off, because the next thing she knew, someone was shaking her awake. It was still dark outside. Time, said Tahina simply, his face solemn in the harsh light of the electric lantern. They gathered their equipment in silence. The talismans, small knives for the blood offering, flashlights, radios, and water. The military provided each of them with a sidearm as well, though Dr. Loron doubted bullets would do much against whatever waited in the stone forest. As they prepared to board the vehicles that would take them to their positions, the young geologist, Uri, approached Dr. Loron. I need to tell you something, he said quietly, eyes darting nervously to ensure they weren't overheard. About the survey team 3 years ago. Dr. Loron looked at him sharply. What about them? We found something before they disappeared, Eri confessed. A chamber deep in the Tsingy. Not natural. Man-made, with inscriptions covering the walls. Why didn't you report this? She demanded. We did, he insisted. But after the disappearances, it was classified. I only saw photographs. But the inscriptions, they match what's in that journal. Same symbols, same language. Dr. Lawrence mind raced. Did the photos show where this chamber was located? Eri nodded. Central Tsingy, about 2 kilometers in from the eastern edge, where the formations are tallest. Did anyone enter it? My supervisor and 2 others, Eri said, his voice dropping even lower. They never came out. That's when the drums started. A horrible suspicion formed in Dr. Lawrence's mind. Eri, was this chamber a tomb? His face paled. How did you know? Because that's what the Tsingy is, she realized. A prison, a tomb, built to contain something ancient. and your team accidentally set it free. Before she could press him for more details, General Razafai called for them to move out. The conversation would have to wait. Dawn was just breaking as they approached the Tsingy perimeter. The massive limestone formations cast long shadows across the landscape, somehow more menacing in the early morning light than they had been in darkness. Dr. Loron was escorted to her position by two stone-faced soldiers who checked in continuously with base camp as they walked. No one had forgotten what happened to the previous teams who ventured too close to the stone forest. "This is as far as we go," the lead soldier said as they reached the designated spot marked with a red flag. "Radio check every 5 minutes. If you miss 2 checks, we're coming in to get you." Dr. Loron nodded, setting down her pack and removing the talisman. From this position, she could just barely make out the forms of the other participants taking their places around the Tsingy's perimeter. According to the ritual, they needed to act simultaneously, precisely as the sun cleared the horizon. They would have maybe 2 minutes to get it exactly right. 60 seconds came Tahina's voice over the radio. "Prepare your talismans." Dr. Loron removed the small knife from her pack, holding it poised over her fingertip. The limestone figurine sat on the ground before her, its hollow chest waiting for her blood. 30 seconds, Tahina continued. "Begin the invocation on my mark." She took a deep breath, focusing on the strange syllables she had memorized. Around the perimeter, 6 others were doing the same. "Mark!" As one, they began to recite the ancient words, their voices carrying across the landscape in eerie synchronicity. Dr. Loron pricked her finger, letting a drop of blood fall into the hollow of the talisman. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The moment her blood touched the limestone, the figurine began to glow with the same bluish light they had seen emanating from the eyes of the stone people. The ground beneath it trembled slightly. "Keep going." Tahina's voice crackled over the radio. "Don't stop the invocation." Dr. Loron continued reciting, trying to keep her voice steady as the talisman began to pulse with light, beating like a tiny heart in rhythm with her words. From within the Tsingy came a sound that chilled her to the bone, a wailing, like thousands of voices crying out in anguish. The drums began, louder than ever before, no longer rhythmic but chaotic and desperate. "They know what we're doing," someone said over the radio, the village chief, his voice tight with fear. "They're coming." Dr. Loron looked up from her talisman to see movement within the Tsingy, dozens, perhaps hundreds of figures emerging from the stone, their forms shifting between human and mineral as they moved with impossible speed across the razor-sharp formations. And they were heading directly for the 7 ritual participants. "Hold your positions." General Razafai bellowed over the radio. "Continue the ritual." Dr. Loron forced herself to keep reciting the invocation. Even as the figures drew closer, behind her, she heard the distinctive sound of the soldiers' weapons being readied. The wailing from the Tsingy grew louder, and now she could make out words within it. Her name, over and over, mixed with pleas and threats and promises. "Amy," the voices called. "Stop this. Join us. We can show you wonders beyond imagining, knowledge beyond time." The temptation to listen, to respond, was almost overwhelming. Part of her, the scientist, the knowledge seeker, wanted desperately to understand what they were offering, but she kept reciting, her voice growing stronger as she reached the final phrases of the invocation. Around the perimeter, the others were doing the same, their voices creating a counter-rhythm to the chaotic drumming from the Tsingy. The stone figures were almost at the perimeter now. In the rising sunlight, Dr. Loron could see their features more clearly. Men and women from different eras, their clothing and appearances spanning centuries. Some looked ancient, with traditional Malagasy features. Others were more recent. And at their front, leading the charge toward her position, was Kodo. His body was almost entirely stone now, only his eyes retaining a semblance of humanity as they fixed on her with desperate intensity. "Amy," he called, his voice somehow carrying over the cacophony. "Don't do this. You don't understand what's at stake." For a fraction of a second, she hesitated, the invocation faltering on her lips. "It's not him." Tahina's voice cracked through the radio. "Whatever it's saying, it's not him. Finish the ritual." Dr. Loron forced herself to look away from Koto's pleading eyes, focusing instead on the glowing talisman at her feet. With the final words of the invocation, she plunged the figurine into the earth. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A shockwave of energy blasted outward from all 7 talismans simultaneously, converging on the Tsingy in a blinding flash of blue-white light. The stone figures froze in their tracks, their wailing cutting off mid-cry. The ground beneath Dr. Loren's feet heaved violently, throwing her backward. The soldiers caught her, dragging her away from the perimeter as fissures began opening in the earth, spreading toward the Tsingy like hungry mouths. "Fall back." General Razafai ordered over the radio. All teams fall back immediately. They retreated to the vehicles, watching in awe as the very landscape seemed collapsing on itself. The towering limestone formations of the Tsingy, formations that had stood for millennia, were sinking into the earth, taking the frozen stone figures with them. "Is this supposed to happen?" Dr. Loron gasped, clutching her radio. "Tahina, is this part of the ritual?" There was no response. "Tahina," she tried again. "Anyone from Team 3 report." "Team 3 is down," came a soldier's frantic voice. "Repeat, Team 3 is down." The ground opened up beneath them. Dr. Loron felt her blood turn to ice. Team 3 had been Tahina's position. "Extract them," she shouted into the radio. "There's nothing to extract," the soldier replied grimly. They're gone. The earth just swallowed them." Before she could process this, another voice broke in, the village chief. "Team 5 is lost as well. The healer and her guards. The stone took them. One by one, reports came in of teams being lost, not to the stone figures, which remained frozen in place, but to the earth itself, which seemed to be reclaiming the Tsingy and anyone too close to it. In the end, only 3 of the 7 ritual participants survived. Dr. Loron, the hunter, and the young geologist Ari. The others have been taken, along with nearly a dozen soldiers. As they huddled in the command tent, watching satellite imagery of the continuing collapse, General Razafai approached Dr. Loron, his face ashen. "What have we done?" he asked quietly. "What was necessary?" she replied, though the words fell hollow in her mouth. "The Tsingy is being rebound, contained." "At what cost?" the general demanded. 13 of my people, for civilians, including your friend Tahina." Dr. Loron had no answer for him. She stared at the satellite images, watching as the once vast expanse of the stone forest continued to sink into the earth, leaving behind a barren, crater-like depression. Ari joined them, his young face aged by what he had witnessed. "The journal," he said suddenly. "Did anyone recover Tahina's grandmother's journal?" The general shook his head. "It was with him." "Then we'll never know," Ari murmured. "Know what?" Dr. Loron asked. "If this was actually part of the ritual," Ari explained. "The sacrifice." The word hung in the air between them, terrible in its implication. "No," Dr. Loron said firmly. "Tahina would have told us if the ritual required sacrifices." "Would he?" Ari challenged. "If he knew it was the only way to stop the Tsingy? If he knew no one would agree to it otherwise?" Dr. Loron wanted to argue, but doubt had already taken root in her mind. She remembered Tahina's grim determination, his insistence that the ritual be completed no matter what happened. Had he known all along that it would require lives? Had he volunteered himself as one of those sacrifices? 6 months later, Dr. Loron stood at the edge of what had once been the Tsingy de Bemaraha. The massive depression left by the collapsed stone forest had partially filled with rainwater, creating a lake where nothing had existed before. The military perimeter remained, though it had been scaled back significantly. No one had reported hearing drums since the ritual. No more wet footprints had appeared. No more stone figures had been seen moving among the remaining limestone formations at the lake's edge. According to all official reports, the crisis was over. The geological anomaly had been successfully contained. The mysterious disappearances had stopped. But Dr. Loron couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over, merely paused, like it had been after the ritual performed by Tahina's grandmother's generation. A temporary solution to an ancient problem. "We're breaking camp tomorrow," said General Razafai, joining her at the overlook, leaving just a small monitoring station. "The government wants to reopen the area by next year." "That's a mistake," Dr. Loron said quietly. "Perhaps," the general conceded, "but without proof of ongoing danger, I can't justify maintaining quarantine." She understood his position. From the outside, it looked like success. The strange formations were gone, the disappearances had stopped, and what was left was just a new lake in an already ecologically diverse region. Perfect for tourism, once the tragedy faded from public memory. "There's something I wanted to give you," the general said, handing her a small wooden box. "My men found it yesterday while dismantling the outer perimeter fence." Dr. Loron opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was a limestone figurine, identical to the ones they had used in the ritual, but intact, untouched by blood. "Where exactly was this found?" she asked. "About a kilometer beyond the old Tsingy boundary," the general replied. "In the direction it was expanding before we performed the ritual, like it was waiting." She closed the box quickly, an inexplicable dread washing over her. "I'll take this to the university. Have it analyzed." The general nodded. Though they both knew no analysis would reveal the truth of what had happened here, or what might still be waiting beneath the placid surface of the new lake. As Dr. Loron prepared to leave the overlook, she paused, looking out over the water one last time. For just a moment, so briefly she might have imagined it, she thought she saw ripples forming on the lake's surface. Ripples in a perfect rhythm, like distant drums. But when she blinked, the water was still again, reflecting only the cloudless sky above. She turned away, clutching the box containing the 8th talisman, the one that should not exist. As she walked back toward the waiting vehicles, she found herself wondering not if, but when she would need to use it. Because deep down, in the part of her that had heard her name in the drums and felt the pull of the stone, she knew the truth. The Tsingy wasn't gone. It was merely sleeping. And someday it would wake again, hungry for new stories to add to its ancient collection. Hungry for her. The end.